everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar in the Liftoff series on offshore wind. In this webinar, we are going to walk you through key points on the market today, recent challenges experienced by the sector, and solutions underway to help the industry reach liftoff. I'm Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer for the Department of Energy and the Director of the Office of Technology Transition. Today, we'll be hearing from Jigar Shah, the Director of the Loan Programs Office, and Jocelyn Brown-Saraceno, the Offshore Wind Energy Lead for the U.S. Department of Energy, followed by a presentation of key findings from the report by Brett Anders and Jonah Uri, the lead authors of the report. The Offshore Wind Report is the product of extensive collaboration among our DOE teams, the modeling team and market experts at the National Renewable Energy Lab, the state governments driving offshore wind procurement today, and industry experts who gave dozens and dozens of interviews. So thank you for that. To kick off our webinar, I want to lay out a few key points from the report. First, the U.S. offshore wind market is at an inflection point. Despite facing macroeconomic challenges, the sector is adapting and improved risk mitigation is being built into project planning. Second, state leadership has been and will remain fundamental as state goals and offtake schedules provide the foundation for the first set of U.S. offshore wind projects. Federal policy, of course, is also key, including use of long-standing tools and new resources made available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Third, the offshore wind sector is poised for liftoff, beginning with the 10 to 15 gigawatts of projects with a path to final investment decision in the next few years. These projects will lay the foundation for consistent long-term deployment, decarbonization, and economic benefits across the country. Longer term, offshore wind can deliver over 100 gigawatts of clean power by 2050. The report was recently launched at the Oceanic IPF conference, and we have received positive feedback since then. As with our other liftoff reports, the Offshore Wind Report is designed to provide a fact base and primer on the industry, while also delving into market challenges and themes of interest to those working in the space. All feedback is welcome, and our team is available for future conversations, so please reach out. Thank you again for joining today's webinar, and we are excited to continue to collaborate with all of you, the entire ecosystem, on advancing offshore wind and expanding the Liftoff series. With that, I'll hand it off to my friend Jigar to talk about the offshore wind investments that we're seeing across the U.S.
Thank you, Vanessa, and hello to everyone listening. It's great to be with you today. I want to dig into what the Loan Programs Office is doing and achieving on offshore wind's role in decarbonizing coastal load, both in this decade and in the long term. As of the Liftoff Reports publication, we have about 250 megawatts of operational offshore wind in the U.S., with another 5 gigawatts under construction and over 10 gigawatts approved for construction. Long term, our analysis shows that offshore wind could provide more than 100 gigawatts by 2050. Now, let's talk about costs. We know the cost of individual projects has increased over the past few years. This is true not only for offshore wind projects, but with tens of gigawatts of U.S. projects approaching final investment decision as these macroeconomic headwinds escalated, the U.S. sector was particularly vulnerable. Our team analyzed the main drivers of these cost increases, and we found that the primary causes were rapid inflation of equipment costs, rising interest rates, supply chain constraints, and schedule delays. For recent projects, these shifts occurred during the 3 to 5 year interval between state procurement, when projects lock in fixed revenues, and final investment decision, when projects lock in their costs. This meant that projects were forced to cancel offtake contracts as their costs grew to exceed their secured offtake prices. With all that said, global cost headwinds have begun to stabilize, and new offtake solicitations from states are de-risking development moving forward. Government and industry are drawing on lessons learned with ongoing efforts to refine project and supplier procurement, foster regional collaboration for supply chain and transmission planning, and make investments to support necessary enabling infrastructure. While costs remain elevated today, we see a path to long-term cost reduction as the first set of projects are deployed, industry infrastructure is built out, market risk decreases, macroeconomic headwinds stabilize, and states and developers continue to incorporate risk mitigation into future procurement and project design. High costs are not an intrinsic feature of offshore wind technology. Rather, they emerged due to market conditions over the past few years. The Offshore Wind Liftoff Report sees a path back to levelized cost of energy below $100 a megawatt hour, which may be achievable for projects reaching final investment decision as soon as 2030. Zooming out, from the LPO perspective, we continue to see tremendous interest in various technology areas, including U.S. offshore wind. In total, across all technology areas, LPO has more than $290 billion in loan applications and a substantial pipeline across the offshore wind value chain, including project developments, supply chain facilities, and transmission upgrades. As we all work together to build the clean energy economy and meet growing electricity demand, offshore wind will play an important role in decarbonizing our economy, especially for coastal demand centers. With that, I will hand it over to Jocelyn to talk about ongoing work at DOE and beyond to support offshore wind liftoff.
So thanks so much, Jigger, and thanks to you all so much for joining us today. As we're launching into an overview of the Liftoff Report, I'm going to just take a few minutes to provide a quick synopsis of the work that we're doing across the federal government in this space. The U.S. Department of Energy is working alongside our interagency partners, as well as state governments that drive procurement, to advance the role that offshore wind can play in clean energy and in our clean economy future. Today, I'm going to share a couple key points from the Liftoff Report, particularly why we see that offshore wind is such a critical resource, as well as some quick background on major efforts underway with support from the federal government to advance offshore wind here in the United States. Offshore wind is a central resource in helping decarbonize coastal demand centers and providing an opportunity to revitalize maritime infrastructure and domestic manufacturing. It supports grid reliability and resource diversity with high capacity factor and strong winter production. It also relieves siting pressure associated with land-based clean energy and transmission infrastructure, connecting directly to coastal population centers with high electricity demand. Over the last 3 years, broadly speaking, we've seen significant growth in offshore wind here in the United States. We now have 8 projects approved by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, roughly 250 megawatts in operation, numerous projects under construction, and over 50 gigawatts of seabed under developer control. That said, the last year was a tumultuous one for offshore wind. The industry was hit by a perfect storm of global macroeconomic challenges. The sector is adapting, however, and improved risk mitigation is being built into industry planning. We strongly believe in the future prospects of offshore wind in the United States, and we see a path to future cost reductions. To that end, DOE, in concert with our sister federal agencies, as part of a whole of government approach, is leveraging our resources to help achieve this liftoff and support projects in the near, medium, and long term. I'd like to highlight a few recent updates from our work across the federal government to support offshore wind that align with critical areas of need identified in the Liftoff Report. We're armed with new policy tools and funding under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that incentivize project development, domestic manufacturing, investment in energy communities, and transmission development. Specifically, the Liftoff Report emphasizes the importance of delivering early mover projects. Deploying 10 to 15 gigawatts of U.S. projects will offer the industry valuable experience in the United States in both development and construction processes. And these early movers will help fund key enabling infrastructure and supply chain investment necessary to facilitate long-term build-out. Demand for offshore wind is growing quickly, Global suppliers are meeting U.S. demand for most components for early projects, but widespread supply chain expansion is required to support growing demand both in the United States and abroad. And in particular, the report highlights the availability of ports and vessels as critical to quickly scaling deployment. And we've taken in the federal government some significant steps over the last years to help plan for and advance supply chain and infrastructure development. We're working to help identify needs and develop roadmaps to fill those needs, ranging from support for the National Supply Chain Roadmap, for West Coast planning, port planning analyses, and national workforce development planning. We've provided support for infrastructure development across the federal government with programs like the Department of Transportation's infra and PIDP programs, providing over $675 million in support for offshore wind port development. The Inflation Reduction Act is incentivizing the build out of offshore wind in the United States, as well as the development of a domestic supply chain. For example, just recently, the Department of Energy and the IRS announced over $200 million in wind-related funding through the first round of 48C manufacturing tax credit allocations, with a second round underway. And we're actively supporting the U.S. Treasury as they work to update the domestic content bonus credit guidance for offshore wind. Beyond that, we have additional resources here at the DOE in both our loan program office and our manufacturing and energy supply chain office to support manufacturing. The Liftoff report also highlights the need for transmission development. Transmission development will be key to offshore wind liftoff. Projects face interconnection risks and cost challenges today, and long-term planning can de-risk future development and help build a more resilient and efficient grid long-term. This spring, the Departments of Interior and Energy together released the final version of a comprehensive plan that details how offshore wind transmission could be effectively developed between now and 2050 on the Atlantic coast. And we have a similar effort, including both studies and convenings, underway on the West Coast to build a similar action plan for that region. And importantly, in direct response to tribal input, DOE launched the Tribal National Technical Assistance Program for offshore wind transmission last September and offers support for engagement in offshore wind transmission planning. We are also actively supporting R&D to enable the grid of the future. Over the last year, DOE announced close to $20 million in funding for HVDC research to help advance standards, innovative controls, curricula, and more. And finally, but certainly not least, through the GRIP and TFP programs, the Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office has a combined $13 billion in funding to help support grid development. So we're deeply engaged in helping support both supply chain and transmission assets for offshore wind. Beyond that, we're working hard across the government to ensure that deployment occurs in a manner that is environmentally sustainable, that energy justice is a central part of development, that communities benefit from offshore wind development, and that tribal nations and indigenous knowledge are integral to our planning. Finally, we're working to advance offshore wind research and development to advance offshore wind systems of the future that will be increasingly cost-effective, that address U.S. design conditions, and that reflect supply chain requirements, with notices of intent on the street for over $50 million in funding across a range of topics. So in conclusion, we're hard at work here at DOE and across the federal government to accelerate liftoff for offshore wind. For those of you who are on this call who are already involved, whether you're in state governments or the private sector or other groups, thank you for your partnership. And for anyone who's looking to get involved, please be in touch. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jonah Uri and Brett Anders, who will present key analysis from the liftoff report. And thanks again for your participation today.
Thank you, Jocelyn. My name is Jonah Uri. I'm a transaction specialist within the Loan Programs Office here at DOE. In addition to supporting the LPO's renewables pipeline, I also support offshore wind strategy across the Department of Energy.
And I'm Brett Anders with the Office of Technology Transitions Market Analysis team. I work on the Liftoff Reports, most recently as a co-author on the Offshore Wind Liftoff Report, as well as on supply chain work across technologies.
For the next 20 or 30 minutes, Brett and I are going to walk through some of the key analyses from the report, and you can find the full report at liftoff.energy.gov, and there'll be a QR code at the end of this deck.
To start, just to provide some context on the Liftoff reports, they represent DOE collaboration with the public and private sectors, as well as our work to catalyze commercialization and deployment of technologies for our nation's net zero goals. Previous reports, as well as this one, can be found at the URL listed on this slide. And we welcome any feedback, so questions and comments, please go ahead and send them to liftoff@hq.doe.gov. The full report contains 5 chapters, and they are outlined here. Some of the key messages from the report include that the state of the market is at an inflection point today, and that offshore wind will play a critical role in decarbonization, both near term and long term. We also do a deep dive on cost analysis and analyze recent cost increases, as well as the pathway to cost reduction moving forward. And finally, we conclude that the industry is poised for liftoff today, beginning with the first tranche of projects in 10 to 15 gigawatts with a path to final investment decision in the next few years. And in the report, we go into quite a bit of detail on challenges and solutions for the market, as well as some of the key metrics and milestones to watch in the market moving forward.
So let's start with a 1,000-foot view. Offshore wind is a globally commercially mature technology. There's roughly 70 gigawatts of offshore wind turbines spinning today. And the industry's experienced significant growth over the past several years, roughly 10 times growth in the past decade, and it's projected to grow another 5-fold over the next 10 years. We'll revisit this theme later, as that also creates some pressures on supply chain ramp up to meet this scale of growth. Here in the US, we have some of the best technical resource in the world. The overall offshore wind technical potential here in the US equates to roughly 3 times the power needs for the US electric sector today. On the East Coast, you can see in orange, there's significant fixed bottom resource. So that's the technology that's commercially mature today. Turbines mounted into the seabed with fixed foundations. And then over the next several years, the floating sector, floating wind technology will begin to commercialize, which has significant potential on the West Coast and in other areas across the country, such as the Gulf of Maine. Floating wind starts to become a key technology when water depths exceed about 200 feet, and commercial deployments are expected here in the US as early as the early 2030s.
In the first section of the report, we look extensively at the value of offshore wind power, and in particular, the broad array of value provided by offshore wind, specifically as a clean generation technology. We find that it's a central pillar for decarbonization of coastal demand centers, and that the offtake costs reflect not only the cost to generate the power, but also the cost to deliver it to these coastal load centers, i.e. transmission, as well as the opportunity to revitalize maritime infrastructure and domestic manufacturing. Offshore wind power also has a compelling and distinctive value proposition that complements other clean resources with its high capacity factors and strong winter production, which supports grid reliability and resource diversity. Here on this slide, you can see an analysis that we did looking at the increase in clean generation capacity over the past decade. So we took a look at the 4 US census regions and increases in clean capacity as a fraction of total generation over the past 10 years. And that's shown on this chart as the increase in percentage points. And in particular here, you can see that while there's a lot of progress being made, in particular in the Northeast, there's been a lag in the increase, only 3 percentage points over the past decade, and that adding just 15 gigawatts of offshore wind to the Northeast would increase its clean generation capacity by 11 percentage points and help close that gap. So offshore wind will provide a key resource for meeting load growth, as well as decarbonizing, in particular for regions that would otherwise need to delay fossil retirements or add natural gas. This chart shows the opportunity to scale U.S. offshore wind over the coming decades. Our consolidated market forecast shown through 2035 is based on the average of 3 leading industry forecasts, and that shows 40 gigawatts deployed by 2035. This cannot be taken for granted and will still require continued work to resolve industry challenges, but it is quite feasible and realistic. Longer term, we see that offshore wind can deliver over 100 gigawatts of clean power by 2050. In the chart, you can see 3 dotted blue lines, which represent scenarios modeled in a recent paper published in the Nature journal. And these scenarios found that offshore wind provided about 130 gigawatts by 2050 under a scenario with 95% power sector decarbonization by 2050. Modeling low cost and net zero scenarios found over 200 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed on that same time horizon. In the dotted green line, you can see the state targets across the US based on currently published targets. These phase in over the next several decades and currently total 115 gigawatts by 2050. Deploying 115 gigawatts by 2050, for example, to meet those state targets, would require only a steady deployment of about 5 gigawatts a year, or roughly a quarter increase or 25% increase above the deployment rate that's projected in the near-term market forecasts, which is about 4 gigawatts per year.
Slide shows a snapshot of the current state of the U.S. pipeline as of the publication of this report back in April of this year. The bars in this graph focus on the offtake status of each project. And at a high level, there's roughly 50 gigawatts of seabed that's been leased to developers and under developer control. From that, we have 250 megawatts of power operational today and roughly 6 gigawatts under construction. 11 gigawatts of projects remain at risk but have a path to near-term offtake. And there's also 7 gigawatts of mature projects whose offtake was canceled, but there's potential for redevelopment longer term. So despite some of the recent news headlines you may have seen, there are gigawatts of offshore wind moving forward in the US today. And at a high level in the next few years, there's roughly 5 to 10 gigawatts of projects that have a path to reach final investment decision and begin construction to lay the foundation for the long-term needs of the industry.
Those of you familiar with other liftoff reports will know that a key feature of the liftoff reports is the pathway to commercial liftoff and the definition of liftoff for the technology that's being discussed. So in the case of offshore wind, we found that offshore wind liftoff can be achieved in less than 10 years, driven by deployment of projects in the 2020s, several of which are under construction today. Liftoff for offshore wind will require steady deployment enabled by continued refinements to project sequencing and funding. Full-scale offshore wind liftoff will proceed in 3 overlapping phases. First, a committed demand pipeline. Second, early project delivery. And third, steady deployment and continued supply chain expansion. In the fixed bottom market, phase 1 is on track for liftoff. Phase 2 is underway today, and phase 3 will follow soon. Floating market is somewhat earlier stage today, but will build directly on the deployment and supply chain of fixed bottom wind this decade.
This slide shows a framework for understanding the cost of offshore wind and some of the potential opportunities for cost reductions through roughly a final investment decision date of 2030, meaning a project that would reach its operational date in the mid-2030s. First, just to level set on some important assumptions, this is a look at the fixed bottom market here in the East Coast primarily, and the dollar terms here are 2024 nominal levelized cost of energy, so LCOEs. It's worth highlighting that these are not bid prices. Those tend to be shorter than the 30-year lifetime LCOEs we're looking at here, and bid prices reflect offtake contracts that often have different pricing terms and are a function of competitive dynamics for each state's solicitation approach. These costs also exclude wider investments in supply chain and grid network upgrades that are often socialized into offtake prices today. Given the inherent uncertainties in the market, particularly with respect to macroeconomic challenges, these estimates should not be interpreted as a cost forecast, but rather a framework for understanding the cost of offshore wind today and into the future. Just to highlight some of the key messages, and we'll get into more detail in the next few slides. The cost increases we've seen over the past few years are primarily driven by macroeconomic conditions and global economic headwinds. There are also some key cost reduction opportunities that are accessible to projects now, but not all of these will be able to be accessed by the most mature projects that we're looking to sort of pave the path for this foundation of the industry. And another key conclusion from this chart, you can see in the lighter green color there, under future cost reduction potential, is that deployment is key to bringing down costs over time. Low costs for a future US offshore wind market is dependent on having consistent deployment and learning from the initial wave of projects that are expected to be built over the next several years. This next slide goes into detail on some of the underpinnings of where costs have increased over the past few years. And what we've seen to date is that largely there's a good news story here, and that these cost pressures are stabilizing. There are three key drivers to why costs have increased over the past few years. Those three drivers that we've broken down here in this chart are rising costs of debt and costs of capital in general as a function of rising interest rates, then CapEx and OpEx overruns, which result from increasing budgets for supply chain facilities, increasing budgets for equipment cost, and general over demand for the supply chain here in the US and globally. And then the third bucket is what we've called general inflation, and that is all indexable cost factors from commodities to labor costs, et cetera, that have driven costs up for offshore wind as with other sectors. We unpack this in more detail in the report, but we felt it was important to sort of show the relative weighting of these key forces, albeit every project experienced financial pressures differently.
Just to briefly go into a little more detail on two of the factors that Jonah mentioned, here we present a more detailed look at some of the drivers of cost increases for offshore wind projects, specifically around increasing macroeconomic costs. Or specifically here we have an inflation increase, an inflation index for underlying offshore wind cost inputs, as well as on the bottom of the slide, changes in financing costs over time. So first, in the inflation chart, we show one example inflation adjustment mechanism, which is a metric designed to de-risk exposure to increases in cost inputs. And what this mechanism does is it looks at the shifts in underlying costs and then weights them based on that weighting you can see on the right, and provides an index which we baseline to the 2018-2021 average here in this chart. So you can see an increase of 25 to 30% from that average to the peak. The bottom chart shows how increases in interest rates drove higher financing costs for offshore wind projects. And this chart uses the secured overnight financing rate, or SOFR, as a proxy for the cost of capital for these projects. The SOFR forward curve informs our outlook on interest rate reduction potential, which you can see in the dotted line there. And importantly, for offshore wind, it's highly sensitive to the cost of capital. So a 2% increase in the cost of capital from debt alone would lead to about a 20% increase in LCOE in and of itself. In both of these cases, you can see that the forward outlook, while uncertain, is stabilizing, and even in recent months, we've seen stabilization. So that's part of what informs a de-risked perspective on the sector moving forward.
So this slide looks at some of the opportunities for cost reductions in the fixed bottom US sector through roughly a final investment decision date of 2030. We wanted to look at the medium-term cost reduction potential, which, as you can see, jumping straight to the bottom, results in a lower impact from technology innovations, although they will continue to be important longer term. In the medium term, costs will come down through a few key drivers, and some of these cost reduction drivers are already actionable today, although mature projects, the ones that are looking to execute in the next year or two, they may not have full access to these cost reductions, and others will come through deployment, as you can see by the supply chain build out bucket, the second from the bottom. There's also policy support mechanisms, whether or not it's bonus ITC credits or financing support from entities such as LPO. And then there's the third bucket is macroeconomic improvements. So the first would be a reversion to historical norms for commodities prices, which peaked from 2022 to 2023 in response to global economic disruptions due to rising interest rates, invasion of Ukraine, COVID, et cetera. And the last, which we've already spoken about before, is interest rates. And a come down to historical norms on interest rates, or even just a 2% to a 2 percentage point reduction, as shown here, would have a significant impact on the future costs of offshore wind. When we put all of these forces together, you get to an environment whereby cost below $100 a megawatt hour from offshore wind here in the US is feasible, albeit we can't count on this. Macroeconomic conditions, auction design, and the number of at-risk projects today that are able to move forward will all dictate how quickly and to what extent we can capitalize on these cost reduction levers. So this is a theoretical cost future in a 2030 environment, not a forecast for what we expect costs to look like over the next several years.
One of the key sections of the report delves into challenges and solutions facing the sector. Many of these solutions are underway today, so that is good news and good progress that's already being made with continued work to be done across many of them. So just to quickly highlight a few of the key themes explored in more detail in the report. First of all, competitive procurements for projects that secured offtake pre-2023 can unlock key investments in enabling infrastructure and continue to put the industry on the path to liftoff. Second, efforts to shorten the offtake FID timing interval, de-risk projects through procurement reforms, and fill funding gaps for enabling infrastructure will mitigate deployment risks facing the sector today. Third, consistent offshore wind procurement schedules and cross-state collaboration on supply chain and transmission planning will enable efficient and bankable industry build-out. And finally, looking at transmission, coordinated solicitations for onshore upgrades, offshore wind projects tailored to efficient transmission design, and the mobilization of inter-regional transmission planning can lead to more efficient outcomes and help de-risk future deployment.
This slide identifies some of the key market structures that have amplified project deployment risks over the past several years and are the target of the risk mitigation measures that Brett just looked at on the last slide and that we talk about in more detail in the report. The first is the sequencing of offtake and securing your offtake contracts with finalizing your project permits and reaching final investment decision. So the paradigm historically was that there was a several year gap, something like 3 to 5+ years between when you secured your revenue contract, your offtake contract, and when you were able to secure your costs. And that gap, that period of exposure meant that, as shown in the second icon, projects were highly exposed to macroeconomic shifts and uncertainties during that period. There's also a key uncertainty for many projects in their interconnection, in that projects don't have confidence in what it's going to cost and the timeline for upgrading their point of interconnection prior to when they have to commit to an offtake price from a state procurement mechanism. The third relates to the need for funding for enabling infrastructure prior to the anchor customer, the offshore wind project, reaching its own final investment decision. There's somewhat of a chicken and egg issue here, whereby a lot of the enabling infrastructure needed for the long-term industry requires investment even before the first user of that infrastructure it has reached their final investment decision and is willing to start having capital flow into this enabling infrastructure. That brings us to the fourth one, which is that many of these long-term industry needs, particularly on enabling infrastructure, are tied to those early mover projects, who are in turn tied to their offtake contracts and offtake commitments. So the early movers were a primary engine to fund the long-term ecosystem build-out for offshore wind here in the US, whether or not it's ports, vessels, supply chain, et cetera. And that creates a tension with our final icon we have here, which is just that all of these projects are generally built through a competitive auction framework, and competitive auctions by nature reward ambitious projects. So reward projects with limited margins, cost margins for unforeseen budget additions and limited flexibility to adapt in the face of unforeseen challenges. All of that conspired to create an environment where the recent market turbulence was faced really head on by these projects. And that exposure can be limited moving forward, even if uncertainties to some of these underlying macroeconomic forces persist through time. This next slide is a double click on that chicken and egg problem of the funding gap. So as you can see at the timeline on the bottom, this blue box shows the period during which we need to begin construction on the enabling infrastructure, whether or not it's a port, a vessel, a manufacturing facility, but that investment needs to begin prior to the project that will anchor that investment being able to sign their contracts and commit to utilizing and purchasing a product because of its own ties to its offtake and development timeline. So this equates to typically hundreds of millions required for each individual piece of enabling infrastructure prior to the offshore wind project reaching their FID. And we touch on this in more detail in the supply chain section and the transmission section of our report, but it's a key area of risk that we focus on, and part of the reason why building out the initial wave of projects and getting over this hump of this chicken and egg is a key force to help lock in the future of the industry.
Looking at the supply chain in a bit more detail, we identify both components that are on the critical path to liftoff, as well as components in areas of investment that represent opportunities or risk mitigation for U.S. supply chain. In the first category, we have ports, vessels, and local workforce and training centers, and consider those essential enabling infrastructure, which could be rate limiting on building U.S. projects and deployment. In the second category, we have towers and jackets, monopiles, transition pieces, and monopile grade steel, as well as blades and nacelles and subsea cables and substations. And all of these represent opportunities to build the U.S. manufacturing base, economic development, supply chain security, and leverage subsidies. And in the short term, especially, we're able to source most of these globally, but as global demand increases and the overall supply demand balance is more constrained, we will have a need for additional production in the US. Finally, in the report, we also go a little deeper on transmission and identify several of the the near-term and long-term challenges and solutions. In the near term, the current interconnection approach is manageable for the 2020s pipeline, although some risks remain. Post 2030, interconnection challenges could constrain long-term deployment and represent a potential hurdle to development and private investment across projects and supply chain. Long-term planning promises to de-risk offshore wind projects, and interregional transmission also has the potential to drive a more resilient and efficient grid.
Thanks so much for your time today. Here on the screen, you can see two QR codes. One is to the Liftoff report itself, and the other is to a summary of all of the federal offshore wind resources in a document that was prepared just after the report was published. Just to voice over some of the key conclusions from the report while you hopefully click on your phones and open up these links. The first is that offshore wind plays a critical role in coastal decarbonization, one that's challenging to replace with other clean sources alone, particularly in the Northeast. The second is that roughly 6 gigawatts of projects are underway today, but a total of 10 to 15 gigawatts are estimated to be needed this decade to ensure a robust domestic supply chain and de-risk some of the long-term needs for the industry when it comes to enabling infrastructure and proving out the US sector. And the third is that state policy really drives the offshore wind market more so than other technologies. The IRA and other policy mechanisms offer sustained support for the sector, but thus far, federal tools accessible haven't been enough alone to overcome the near-term deployment bottlenecks and hurdles driven by macroeconomic conditions. So thank you so much for your time, and please reach out if you want to discuss further.